Hey YouTube, this is Aaron, the Custoda, and today I want to show you how to build a date time picker, or excuse me, a date picker that allows you to use the date picker control UI date picker inside of MonoTouch with a C# application. Now with the date picker, there's some, it's really cool. It gives you these spinning wheels so you can select things like month, day, and year. But one of the problems is getting rid of the control. So I'm going to use a concept that Apple has used in Safari 6. Which, if you go into Safari 6 and you basically click on a text box and you get the regular keyboard up, it turns out there's multiple text boxes on the screen. They give you this nice little rectangle above the keyboard that allows you to select between the text boxes, and you can arrow back and forward. And you also, there's a done button that says you're done, which is kind of slick. I really wish that they'd do that with the rest of the controls and give that out to the community. They haven't done that yet. So until then, it's up to us as developers to come up with custom solutions to do that. So with that, I'm going to give a demo on how to do that today. So to start out with, I always like to tell people what version of Mono I'm using. So I am on Mono Develop 3047, so hopefully you're on at least that version or higher. And right now my iOS version is at 6, so my emulator is running iOS 6. And Xcode has been updated for iOS 6 also, so that latest release in Xcode. From the Mono Develop, I'm going to go to File, New, and Solution. We're going to build a new solution. This is going to be a very simple C# MonoTouch application. So we're just going to go to iPhone under MonoTouch, and we're going to select the single view application, the most basic application, if you ask me, you could build in for the iPhone. We'll just call this Date Picker Demo, and click OK. And by default, we should get some classes. We should get the app delegate, which we will never use because we have a controller. And our controller is where we're going to write all of our code in for talking to our UI. And we need a custom control to do this, basically. So my plan is this. I'm going to make an action sheet. An action sheet is the kind of UI model that comes up when you have the keyboard. It kind of grays out the rest of the screen and it gives you the keyboard up. So I'm going to use an action sheet on a custom view. And I'm going to throw a button, a done button that people can click above the control for the datetime picker so that when they're done, they can click it. And then right below that done button, we'll have the actual physical datetime picker. So pretty easy. It doesn't take a lot of code. Now, I've taken this idea from Apple's design and from reading a couple different blog articles and going onto the forums, the Mono Develop forums, and reading a little bit about MonoTouch and coming up with this solution. Other people do it other ways. This is just one more way you can do it. So to start with, we need to make a custom class to basically call our UI code that we're about to write. Normally I like to use Xcode for this, but we're making a custom control, and while you could design that in Xcode, I find it easier to write this particular stuff in regular good old C# code. So I'm going to just make a general C# class, and I'm going to call this AS, stands for kind of action sheet date picker. So we have an action sheet date picker class that we're building. It's a custom control. And in order to build a custom control, we need to use some other classes that are available. So the other classes that we need to use are going to be, for example, system drawing. So that you should be used to that if you've done any .NET development with using drawing, the graphics G object, for example. You'd have to use system drawing. It also holds all the colors, which are kind of often you want to get access to, especially if you're a web developer. I also need to use the Mono framework. So Mono, the folks that make MonoTouch are nicely enough to make mappings between Apple's framework, which is called Foundation. That's the Cocoa. That's where all the objects like in a string live. And also the UI toolkit, which is where all the custom view controls that come up, like, your UI view, your UI button, UI label, all those kind of things. So we need to make references to those so we can use those. So I'm going to make a reference to Foundation and also to UI toolkit so that we have access to all those nice controls that Apple's written for us. Because realistically, all we're going to do is combine some of those controls together. That makes logical sense, right? So we're making a class. In order to make that class, we need to register it with MonoTouch's Foundation. So how we do that is we're going to make some square brackets above the class name, and we're going to use the registration method that the Foundation kit gives us. So MonoTouch, and this is a mapping once again, so under Foundation, we're going to need a register option, and we just need to pass it a string. So I'm going to call this slide on date picker. Makes sense, right? We're registering here our class. So now we have our public class here. I like to use regions. Regions hide code together, kind of groups code together, and then you can basically use the plus and minus side to hide it when you don't want to view it. I like those. It makes my code cleaner, and it also kind of documents it a little bit. So I'm just going to call my first region private variables. Variables and region. Tab to complete that, and then let's go ahead and make some private variables. So the first thing we need is a UI action sheet. Like I was saying before, that's the thing that comes up when you make a keyboard today. So the first thing we want to make is we're just going to call this action sheet for lack of originality. Now, some of you guys are used to writing code and just writing two-letter names for your objects. I don't like that. And the reason why is when I'm knee-deep in my code, 1,000 lines in, I have no idea. If I were to just name that AS, what's AS? It could be 100 different things. So I like to name it what it is. And Apple, if you write an object C, they really tell you to do that too. And you get used to it, and it's really kind of nice. So the next thing I'm going to make is a UI button from code. Now, you're used to probably doing this in Xcode. In the interface builder, which is perfectly fine. We're going to make one via code. Now, the amount of code it takes to write a button could be a lot. So Apple is using, and actually the MonoTouch people are using this, but realistically Apple also has the same thing, a factory. And what a factory is basically it gives you the ability to use a static method to return a button of a certain type, for example. And think of it like a pizza place where you go to the pizza place and say, hey, give me a pepperoni pizza. You really don't care how they made that pepperoni pizza. You just want to know that when you get a pepperoni pizza, it's got cheese, sauce, pepperoni, and it's a certain size. So the same thing with a button. The amount of things that you would have to send a button to normally make one, do you want to memorize all that stuff and then call a constructor and send all that stuff in? Or do you want just a really nice, easy method you can call to do that? So I really like factory, the factory pattern, and I highly recommend you research that if you've never used it before because it really does make your code look really nice. So the factory method that you can use is called FromType. So UI button dot FromType, and we're going to send it a UI button type here, and we're going to hit period, and it's going to give us all the different type of buttons that we can get from this factory. The one that we're going to get by default is the round rect. I really like that one. It's the static default one. So we're going to just tell right now when we're defining it, we're saying, hey, you know what? We want a new button. We're not calling it a constructor. We're not saying new. We're still getting a pointer. So this is still a new object, but this static method, this factory method, is automatically giving us a button, setting all the different properties it needs to set to make that button look like it needs to. And then we're basically getting a reference to that button, a pointer, reference that button inside of this variable. So that's kind of neat. Now we also we need a view, because a view is basically like where we put all of our controls on. In MonoTouch, no matter what, you're always going to have a view, and on that view lives a bunch of controls. So we have a bunch of controls, but we need to stick those controls somewhere. So we're going to make a UI view. We're just going to call it owner. And the reason I call that owner is because Apple has a naming convention. And if you go into Xcode and you drag some stuff, you always see files owner. That's basically the class that basically owns that view and has those controls inside of it. So I like using that naming convention. It makes sense. And so we're going to just use that. The final thing we want to do is make a label. And the label is just going to be the title of the control itself that will be right next to the button. So we're going to need a UI label for that. And we'll just call that label title. And we're just going to call a new UI label so I don't have to do that later. Just to remind myself of that. Now, once again, I like using camel case. So you can see here, I've just shortened the name label with LBL title. That's the way I like to code. You don't have to code like that, but I have written C# before. I've also written Object-C. So as you can see here, button done. I'm used to writing buttons like that way. I'm mix and matching. Probably shouldn't do that. If your company has a standard naming convention, you should probably be following that. I'm going to close this now because I don't need to see those private variables ever again, it turns out. So you can just kind of use the plus and minus here to hide that code. It's still there. You just hit it. That's what regions do. Really like regions a lot. So we're going to make another region, and we're going to call this region public properties. And I like to do that just so I can have my public properties too. Now for our public properties, we need to make that date picker, that UI date picker, so that basically we need to make that public so that when they click the button and we select that and we take the date picker away, somebody can still find out what the date selected was. Makes kind of sense, right? So we're going to just call this a prop. Now, I like to use snippets in Visual Studio. And what snippets are just free code that Microsoft's going to give to you for free. The cool thing is they call those templates in MonoDevelop, and a lot of the snippets that they had inside of Visual Studio are available inside of MonoDevelop. So you can see here, this little kind of like a piece of paper ripped, that means it's a snippet. So I'm going to type the word prop in and hit tab. And when I hit tab twice, it automatically writes the code for a property for me. And now it lets me tab between the two things I can change. So the first thing I want to change is the object type. And this is going to be of UI date picker. And then when I just need to name my object name, which I'm just going to call date picker. And that's it. So now that I've got that code kind of written, by theory, this should work. And we'll just call it date picker. Now, for some reason, I was having this earlier. When I did this, it wasn't necessarily always working, even though I had this set properly. What I'm going to do is see whether or not, see the little squiggly line, that means that the code is not working for some reason. And so what's coming up with is, it's coming up with saying uninspected symbol public. So that means that it's really not happy with something in here. So I'm going to get rid of my region and see if that's what's causing the problem. And it's not, because it's still coming up and saying that we have errors. And it's still coming up and saying uninspected symbol. The parser is not liking the word public. So even though our class is public, our class is right here. We have public picker. Oh, wait. That's what's going on here. We're in our constructor right now. As you can see here, we are inside the constructor method, and that's where we're getting problems here. Duh. I should not be making this code inside of my constructor. I should be making this outside of the constructor. So let's just cut this code and paste it outside. Oh, that is a terrible mistake to make. But hey, look, I'm human. And what I should do is hide my constructor by basically making a region for that. So I'm just going to call this region constructors. So the reason why I couldn't make my public property is because I was making it inside of my constructor, and that doesn't work, obviously. So let's just hide our constructor for right now by making a region and then hiding it. And now we can go back to making our public properties, which makes sense. Region, public properties, and region. And it turns out there's also a snippet for this, and I was too lazy to type it in for the region keyword. You can also surround with, which is really nice with regions. You can do that with if statements and loops also, which is kind of cool. So we're going to say prop again for our snippet. We're going to call this UI date picker. And we're just going to call this date picker for lack of words. And now notice we don't have red squiggly lines anymore. Yay. Helps when you're not making your properties inside your constructor. Let's go ahead and make a title. Now, we want to be able to get back the title so they can change it if they want when they make the control. Obviously, we're holding the title right here, but we really want to give them the ability to change that via string. We don't want to let them know it's a label, though, right? That's our private thing that we have, because then they can start playing with the labels, color, and stuff, and we may want to control over that. So this is a perfect example where a public property, you may want to have access to some of your internal stuff, but realistically, you want to hide a bunch of it too. So we're going to use the prop. I could use the prop keyword, but here we actually don't want to do that per se. Now, I'm going to use it anyways because it's going to save me some typing, but I'm not going to use the default get and setters. So I'm going to just say prop again, and I'm going to return a string, even though our title's held in a label, because all we're going to do is we're going to give it the label string, and so that they can set it and get it, but they won't be able to change anything else in our label. And by doing that, we're going to have the best of both worlds. We give our people that are using our custom control access to that stuff, but we're not going to give them the ability to go hog wild crazy with it. So in our getter, we need to basically return our local label variable, which we call label title, and we're going to return its title label. So let's go here, title, text. Let's just go text, there it is. And then we need to put semicolon because this is a line of C# code. So you can see here we're returning the labels text. Now, when somebody send us a value. If they want to change that, we can do that also. So we're going to say this dot title label. So label title dot text equals value. And value, if you've done property program before, is always a value that's being passed in. Now I don't need the semicolon outside of there. I need the semicolon inside of here. And I need to spell the word value right also. And once you do that, now we have them the ability to access our label's title. And this is one of those perfect examples, like I said, textbook, where you want to give people access to your information inside, but you want to hide a bunch of stuff so that they're not changing crazy things like the colors. And maybe that's just because, like Apple, for example, wants you to use their controls a certain way, and they want them always to look the same way. And we're kind of forcing that also. The final thing that we want to give people access to is our button that we had there, that we used our private button. But we don't want people to set the button. So we're going to make our property read only, and that's pretty easy. All you have to do is just pass it a get and no set. So we're going to do prop again, because we're getting a bunch of free code that we don't necessarily have to write. Oop. And so you're probably wondering, you notice that my keyboard's kind of going crazy all over the place really quickly. How am I doing that? And if you haven't watched one of my previous videos, I'm using the VI keyboard shortcuts, which you could use. VI or Vim was an editor in the Unix days, and I've come from the Unix world of programming in C++. So I'm used to using those key bindings, and I literally have a plugin for .NET that allows me to use that in Visual Studio also. So that's the reason why my cursor is going all over the place. So basically, in order to do a read-only, I'm going to return my private button, which is called button done. But I'm not going to allow them to set it, so I deleted my setter. So with this, I have three public properties. I have my date picker, my label that I want to return so they can set the label of what this control is going to be called, and then the button so that they can handle the events with it. That's all we need. So let's go ahead and just close that public property code out. We've got our private variable code done. So now all we need to do is really go in and start talking about our public constructor. So with our public constructor, we don't want to necessarily have a default constructor of blank. We're going to require somebody send in the view of that's calling this, and that's so that we have access to be able to talk two ways between both the view inside of here. So we have access, whatever view that we have, we can access stuff inside of that view, but we also want to be able to give basically give ourselves access to that via a pointer and any other method code that we have. So with that, what that means basically, and I know that you're going, Aaron, you're not making any sense here, just follow me and you'll see this. So what we're going to do is we're going to require that the view be sent to us. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say our local owner, which is a private variable that we made up here, we're going to say that's going to be equal to the one that they're sending us to start out with. So that sounds pretty easy. So next thing we want to do is we want to configure the label. There's some different properties we want to set on that. So we're going to just make some comments to say configure the label's default properties. And you could make a initiate method to do this. I'm just going to do this inside of the constructor. So I'm going to use this keyword that tells us, hey, we're using local variables inside of our object, and we're looking for the label title. So label title dot background color. We're going to set that equal to UI color. And you can go crazy on this. I'm going to call it clear. And by doing that, it's just going to make this so that we don't have to worry about necessarily matching the color per se of the background to whatever we throw this on. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use label title foreground though, or the text color. Text color. We're going to set that equal to it, and this is where you can kind of experiment a little bit. I like UI color light text color. You can use, there's other ones in there that you want to experiment with, and how you could do that is just simply, for example, type in the word text, and you can see here it's showing us all the different colors of text. So there's a dark text color also that we could try, or you could use other colors. These ones are just designed to be a little bit easier to read with text. So the final thing we want to do is we want to set the font of our label, so that we can say how big we want the title to be so people can read it. So we're going to say font equals. Now the font, if you kind of hover over it when you're making it, or when you make it, it'll tell you where it comes from. And that's really important. So you can see here it's a UI font that I need to send it. So with that, I have an idea of how I need to do that. So I'm going to say UI font, and it turns out if I just hit font dot, it gives me a bunch of different options here. So I'm going to say bold system font of size. And it's asking for a float size, and I'm going to use 18 points. And I think that that's a good place to start. We could make that smaller or larger depending on when we compile it, we take a look at it what we want it to be. But basically that's all we need to do for our label. Next, we're going to actually configure the button. So that's pretty easy actually. We just need to set the title of it. So I'm going to say configure the button. And we're going to just say this dot button done equals, or sorry, set title, because that's what we're attempting to do here. And it's a method. So we're going to do parentheses, and we're going to do, it looks like it needs a title and then a state. So there's different button states, and you can have different titles for different states, depending on what state it's in. We're just going to use the UI control state normal. That is the normal state the button's in, but there are other states, and you may want to research those as you're doing more development. So we do need to also set an action so that when the touch up inside happens, something happens, but let's do that last. Just because that code, is not necessarily hard, but it's just something that we're going to want to deal with later. So let's go ahead and do that code last. We'll come back to that, how we want to handle that delegate. For right now, let's make our action sheet. So let's do configure the action sheet. So with that, we just need to say this.action. And if I could type right today, this.action sheet equals, and we're going to say new action sheet. UI action sheet, and we're going to call the default constructor. Now we want to set some properties of it. So there's a shorthand keyboard for doing that, and how we can do it is just doing our little brackets like that, our squiggly brackets. And what we're going to say is we're going to say the style property of it equals UI action sheet style, action sheet style. And if I could get my arrow keys to agree with me today, action sheet style dot, and you can see here we have some different action sheet options. I like black transparent for this. Now you could also do black opaque or automatic. We're just going to use the black translucent, excuse me. I think that that's the best to use. Now, when you're setting multiple properties and the constructor doesn't necessarily have support for setting those properties, this is the syntax you can use for that. So we have a squiggly line, we're setting our properties, and then squiggly line, semicolon. And in VB, that's where this kind of came from. It was with the with statement. And this is basically giving you that same thing that you could do with the with statement, which is kind of cool. The final thing we need to do is we need to make our date picker, right? So we're going to say configure our date picker. We're going to say date picker equals new date picker. Now, if you take a look at this, it takes a rectangle, F rectangle actually of frame. So we got some problems here. We need to give that a rectangle to use. So once again, one of the nice things is that they, Apple by default, and Mono has taken over that for that too, has given us one that's just empty and we can define it later. Let's do that because we really need to think about that a little bit harder before we actually figure out how we want to make our rectangle of how big we need to make this. So I'm going to say rectangle, and I hope the autocomplete will take over for me, which it did. And there's an option for empty, which means it's just not going to give us one. We could then set this later. What this allows us to do is still set the UI date picker up and really kind of worry about how we want to do it later. So the final thing we need to do is we have our controls. We have our label, our button, and our action sheet, and our date picker. We need to add those into the view. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to say, we'll say now add controls to the UI view. So we're going to say this dot action, or excuse me, not the view, to the action sheet. The action sheet was where everything's going to live on, right? Why I said view is beyond me. We're add subview because I know that it's a subview that we're adding it to. This dot date picker. to start out with. That's going to add the date picker. So if you think about it for a second, the action sheet basically inside of it has a view, and that's where we're putting these controls on. And that's what the add sub view is doing. It's basically saying, okay, inside of the action sheet, we have an internal view, add these controls onto that internal view. So this action sheet dot add sub view, and we're going to say this dot title label. And then we're going to say this dot action sheet. And we're going to say add subview again one more time. And we're going to say this dot button done. And now we have our three controls, also our action sheet added to that. So we're pretty much done with our constructor. We need to come back and let's just do action item, do delegate method, so that we know that later on we need to write that delegate method. Let's now do a region of public methods, and we need to do a region to show this puppy. So if somebody makes one of us, they send us their view. Well, how do we show it? Well, that's pretty easy, right? We'll just make a show method. So public void show. I mean, why make it any more complicated than that? So we're just going to make a default show method here. This is where all the logic's going to get. So this method isn't very complicated, but you know, it's there. So let's go ahead and start with saying, what do we need? Well, we're making a text box basically. Facebook notifications. Don't you love those? Go away. All right. So inside of our show here, we need to start talking about, we want a rectangle above the date time picker. And we're basically need to make how big do we want that to be. So we're going to call that the title bar. And we need to know how many pixels we want to make that to be. Well, for default, I'm just going to use a pixel size of 40. So we'll start out with saying we're going to use a float to define that. We're going to say title bar height equals 40. And we should probably put some comments what this does. So this is need to store the height of the title bar that we will be using to store the label and button. Just because later on we're going to be like, what the heck does that do? We probably should write some comments so and that makes sense. So let's make some more comments too here. We're going to define the size of the button next. And then we can set the button to that size. So how we do that is there's a variable called size f, and that's what we're going to use. So we're going to say our button's name, which if we go up here and take a look, that's called button done. So we're going to call it button done size. And that way, by making it the same name of our variable, we don't have, hey, we know that this is kind of linked to that variable. And we're going to make it 60 pixels by 30 pixels. Now, you can once again play with the size of your button. I have calculated out that I believe that is very similar to the size of Apple's done button. And you may want to make it a little bit thinner than that. So the X and Y variables are right here. So this would be width and height. The 60 is the width, 30 pixels is the height. You may want to make that a little bit, maybe 58, but I like 60. Play with it a little bit. Now that you know that's what that variable does, you can kind of go in and play around with the size a little bit. Now with that, we also need to store action sheet size. So we're going to say define the size of our action sheet. So we need another size f to do the action sheet. So we're going to say size f, and we kind of know the syntax of this. Now we're going to say action sheet size equals, and we need to give it a size. So we're going to say new size f. And now this is where it gets kind of tricky here, right? We want to make this the same size as our window, but we don't know how big our window is, but we do. Remember where we made that view pointer earlier? Well, we passed in the view that we're coming from. Well, inside of that view is actually the size of it. So whether we're on a bigger iPhone, like the iPhone 5, or if we're on the lower iPhone, by passing in the view, we now have the ability to see the frame, basically the view's size. And we don't have to think about how big we want to make our action sheet. We'll just make it the same size as the owner's view, the person that sent us their who's calling us. So this makes it kind of easy for us. So this .owner, and if I spell owner right, it'd be kind of helpful. We can see here in our list. Dot, and if we take a look here, there's an option to say the frame of it, and the frame is going to be the size around it, just like a picture frame, and so we can get the height and width. So we're going to say, hey, height, sweet. Now, excuse me, we need the width first, not the height, right? It's always width and height. I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit because it just makes this kind of easy for us. So we have the width. Now the height we want to do, but we don't want to make this the entire screen because we still want to emulate the ability to see what's above us, right? The whatever is kind of there. We want to give this like the Apple default look and feel. So because of that, we need to figure out how big our date picker is and then how big the title bar is and take those two things and make it that. So how we were going to do this is we're going to say this.datePicker.height, datePicker.frame.height, everything's got a frame, plus the title bar height that we used earlier, that variable that we made to keep track of that. So that makes sense, folks? Let me make our code window a little bit bigger so we can see that. So you can see that all in one line. So that makes sense. We need to give the size f two variables, our left and our width and our height. Our width is going to be whatever the current width is that the UI component that called us, its view width is, and we are requiring that in our constructor up here. And then the actual height of it is going to be the height of our date picker and the title bar that sits above it. Okay, so with that, we now have our two sizes, right? Now we need to make a rectangle, and the rectangle is what we're going to use to actually make the action sheet frame, if that makes sense. As we saw here, everything has a frame. The view has a frame. The action sheets, the date picker has a frame. We need to make a frame for our action sheet. So we're going to need to make one of those rectangle F objects that we saw earlier. That we kind of just, if we remember earlier, I said, well, we'll fix that later. We're going to come back and fix that now. As you can see, the date type picker here, we have a rectangle empty here also. We need to start making some rectangle to fix that problem. So let's just say action sheet frame equals new rectangle. And so with a rectangle, we have some different constructor options. If we take a look here, we have 4 floats, x, y's, width, and height. So if that makes sense, pixels that we're starting to draw from x and y, and then the width and the height of that. So we have 4 floating point numbers we need to send it. Well, if we think about this for a second, we've already kind of calculated a little bit of this earlier when we set it up. If you think about it, we did set it up. So with this size here, that object that we have. So let's say the action sheet size object that we made right here, we have some of these things already available to us. We're going to say that we're going to start drawing this at x coordinate 0. And then we're going to say we're going to start drawing it at this owner frame height minus the action sheet's height. So if we see here the action sheet size variable that we made earlier, that's what we're storing the action sheet size in. And we're going to say the height of that. Now, does that make sense? If you think about it for a second, we don't want this to cover the whole screen once again. So we say, hey, whatever the current height is of the window, whether we're iPhone 4 or 5, we're going to subtract the basically size of our action sheet, and that's how big we're going to make this frame. Now, we also need to pass it the width and the height. Well, we already have those. We stored those in our action sheet size. So we can just call that, that variable that we made earlier, action sheet size, and we send it both the width and height, and just not have to type that in the second time. Save ourselves a bunch of typing. Height. And we can see here we just saved ourselves a bunch of typing. So we're making a new rectangle starting at coordinate 0, and then we're calculating the coordinates dynamically because we don't know how high this iPhone screen is. By sending the view that's calling us into this, we can actually calculate from it, which it should figure out how big the iPhone is, and then basically just make it that minus the size of our action sheet. We now have that done. So realistically, we're getting pretty close. So we need to set some properties on our action sheet to show it. if that makes sense, right? We've got this action sheet. We've got some variables that we can use to make the action sheet. Now let's show it. So we're going to show the action sheet and set up the frame. So let's do to start out with this action sheet, and we're going to show in view. Oops, show in view, which is an option here. This owner. So we're going to say, hey, whatever current owner, so whoever called us, they passed us in that, we're going to overview this action sheet on top of them. So there's multiple reasons we need that pointer to the view that's calling us. And now we need to just set our frame up so that the action sheet has something to draw itself onto. So this action sheet frame equals the action sheet frame that we made. Action. And you can see here, if I were to make this slower, if you take a look at the type of object, it takes as a rectangle F. So we saved our a type in there. We're just going to say action equals action sheet frame. There it is. Just about done. So if we thought about it for a second, now remember what I was telling you that we needed to add the frame also for the date time picker? We need to do that. So we did do that earlier. We kind of said, well, hey, we'll just leave it empty. We'll come back and fix that. So let's fix that also. And I like, if you do this in a certain way, you can reuse your variables that you made earlier inside of these new calls. So you can see here, I made all these sizes earlier. The reason why I made those earlier is so I can reuse those variables without having to have these numbers defined 100 times. So to start out with, we need to go into our date picker and set up its frame. Now we know frames are rectangles, so we need to say that we need a new rectangle F object again, just kind of like what we did up here with the action sheet frame. So we're going to start out with saying that this date picker frame is going to be, it's going to ask us for the same things we had before, X, Y, float, and height. So let's start by saying this date picker dot its frame dot X, which by theory was none, so it should be basically 0, right? But it could be different. We could have set it at some point in time. We're going to make it the title bar height. That's where we're going to start drawing it from. Does that make sense? We have this bar, and we're going to say, hey, we want to start drawing this date picker right after that. So we're going to say, after that, we're going to start drawing, and then we're going to say this date picker, not action sheet, date. If I could type right today, it looks like I'm having one of those typing frame width. And we're going to say this dot frame, it's also its height. This dot date picker, date picker dot frame dot height. Okay, so now we have a frame. And we just need to go through and say this dot date picker. We need to tell it the date type. And how we do that is the mode. And there's multiple modes. And this is an enum. And you can see that we have a date time, and a countdown timer. And the countdown timer is used for the stopwatch application. And you can do date and time. I like the date option. And for our example here, we'll just use that. But once again, you could kind of pass in the mode in the show method, and you could make this customizable where they could send you the mode and you would automatically calculate for that, which is an option. I'm going to hard code this to date, knowing that if I wanted to make this more flexible, I can go back and maybe either handle that mode as a variable coming into the show method, or I could maybe even hold that as a public property that they can go through and check and set. The final thing we need to do is those labels. If we thought about it, I told you everything needs a frame. And we have a frame for both the action sheet and the date and time picker, but we don't have one for our last two controls, the label and the button. So let's go ahead and make their frames so that everything shows up here. So this title label, we're going to say from there, frame equals new, and we're going to say rectangle F, and you can see here we have those 4 things we need. So I'm going to kind of make some guesstimations here. I'm going to say that I want to bring this about 10 pixels from X and 4 down. And that's going to give us a little bit line at the top of our action sheet so that we can kind of see that. And then the last thing we need to do is for the width and height, we're just going to say this owner. Once again, we've been using its frame width. And we're going to say minus 100, because we're going to kind of make this basically over just a little bit. And then we're going to say 35 for the height because we made the title height itself 40. So if you think about it for a second, we need to make sure that there's enough for the border around it. And then we just need to make the frame for the button also. So this button done dot frame equals new rectangle. And we're going to make this one the action sheet size width. And we're going to also subtract that from the done buttons size width. So if you think about that for a second, kind of makes sense. The frame is going to be, we have to watch about how big we're making that button so that the frame isn't too big. So we're going to say done button done, width. Oops. I'm really having one of those bad typing days where my fingers are thinking faster because I'm trying to talk at the same time. Done button. Oop. I forgot to use the size variable that I made. Done button size that we made up here. Remember I said that we'd use those so we would make those. So if I could just actually type that in. Button done size dot width minus 10 coming from where we're coming here. We're going to make it about 7 for the 7 here for the y coordinate. Down, the button's going to be taller obviously than the label, so we have to calculate for that. And then the width and height, well, we've kind of already got that. We made that size variable earlier, so let's just use that. Done button size dot width and done button size dot height. Almost done. So with that, we have our show method done. So now we need to hide this puppy. We need to provide a method to the people when they're done. That was the whole point of this, of providing a hide method that says, hey, when this is done, how do we hide this? So how we're going to do that is we're going to make a public void method, and we're going to call it hide. And we're going to give them the option to animate it, because this is a sheet. Basically, they can animate if they like. Do our little brackets here. Once you do the brackets, you can use the triple slashes to get free documentation, which I like to do. And now we're just going to say this.action sheet, and we're going to say dismiss with a button, click button index, and we're going to just give it index of 0, which means it's the first button. You could, if you have multiple buttons, you could send in the index of what button that you wanted that to be, and you can report on that. There's a method that you can get back to say that. And the reason for that is the action sheet. If you have like the OK and cancel button option, that's what they're giving the index for that. Now, whether or not the animator or not, we're just going to pass in that variable animated, and let the person that calls the hide method make that decision for us. That's it, folks. We pretty much are just about done with this. Now, as I told you earlier, we needed to write the event handler that handles what happens when the button gets clicked, right? And we could basically kind of do that a couple different ways. One, we can handle it in here. Or 2, we can handle it because we have that public variable that we made of the button. We can handle it inside of the view outside of this. So it depends on how you want to handle that. If you want to handle it internally and you don't want to have any business logic, you can handle it here in the constructor and just say by default do it this, knowing that if somebody overrides it because you give them public access to that button, they can override the touch up inside event. So by default, what we're going to do is we're going to come back and finish up this method and say by default we're going to handle it and just get rid of it. However, if somebody wants to write some custom logic and then use the hide method to hide it, we'll also allow for that. If they want to do some calculations before they hide it. Which kind of makes sense if you think about it for a second, right? Maybe I want to get some information. It turns out why you'd want to do that is when you want to get information from the date time picker, like what date time they picked. Well, if you just hide it, you'll never get those values back. So depending on how we want to handle this, I'm just going to make a default delegate method that just basically hides this. But realistically, we will never use it because we'll override it. So we're going to say touch up inside plus equals, and we need to send it both a sender an event arg, and then we're going to make a pointer to a delegate that will handle this. And we're going to say this dot action sheet dot dismiss with button click index, and we're going to say by default we're going to say both button index of 0, and yeah, we would like to animate it because we are on the iPhone and it's got those cool animations that people are kind of used to seeing. So we're basically making a delegate. We're sending it both the sender and the event args, and by default we're just going to call this method. And that's it. Our control is now physically done. So we now just to make our UI use one of these. So we probably should make a UI and give the ability to go through and see the date that they selected. So we'll need a button basically to click so that they brings it up. And then we probably should also then have a label that we can see the results in. So let's open up our zib file that our UI is in. So I'm going to make this bigger so we can see it. And that should call up Xcode. And Xcode takes a few seconds to fire up, which is okay. We know that. And what we're going to do then is we're going to go in and we're going to hide both our solution view so that we can just get more screen real estate. And I talk about this a lot. That realistically, it's kind of nice to get rid of that screen real estate so we can kind of deal with just the stuff that we're trying to work on right now. So we need two controls out that we're going to drag into Interface Builder here. We need a label and we need a button. So I'm going to kind of drag both those controls out. You should already have some idea of how to do this in Xcode. If you don't, then you should probably read up on that. This is not an introduction video by any means. I'm going to change the alignment to the label to be centered, and then I'm going to say no date selected for my text right now, and we'll change that. And we'll change the button's text inside of Xcode here also to be select date. So people know that if they click this button, they can select a date. So that makes sense. So I got a button. I'm using just the built-in options here in the toolbar. And if that's missing under the view option here, you can click the left one and you can get your view back. And it's under our little icons here. If you take a look at them, it's the attributes. You can kind of just click that attribute button here. You have access to all the attributes of your controls. So we can see here, no date selected, and then for our label and that. Now the final thing we need to do, and if you guessed that we need to make some pointers and action methods for our controls here, you're right. We need to be able to access these variables, or these controls inside of our code via variables or pointers. So I'm going to use the editor to bring up our code window and select our code here. And if everything was working right, the editor would bring up our control file. And it is not. So for some reason, Xcode is already misbehaving on us from the standpoint that we cannot see our views controller. So let's go ahead and save this. And this happens from time to time, and you have to exit Xcode, and you have to go back in, and then it sees it. Don't ask me why this sometimes happens, because I would love to know myself, but sometimes you just don't get what you think you're going to get. So let's just click the editor now, and now we have access to our code. I didn't do anything different. I don't know why it does that, and sometimes it does, and I just know if you close Xcode and you bring it open, then it does work. I'm going to close the view on the right so we have more screen real estate to see all this stuff. And I'd mentioned this in one of my other videos. I had the same problem where sometimes it just was not saving back and forth. And like I said, all you could do is close out Xcode, go into MonoDevelop, double click on your zip file, bring it back up. So I'm going to make a pointer to my label, and we're just going to call this label date selected, and that way when we get the date selected from the control that we just made, we can set it inside of that label so we can see what somebody said. So finally we need a button, and I'm going to make an action to the button, and so that's under the connection type of action, and we're just going to say button select date click. And there's a bunch of different types of events that you can handle, but we're going to handle the touch up inside just like we did in our custom code that we made with our custom button for our date time picker. Let's go ahead and click the connect button. And so now we have both an action method that when somebody selects this date button, we can get that, and then we also can set it and put it on this label if we like. Let's go ahead and close out of Xcode because we have everything we need done here. So I'm going to just go File and Save. I always do that because there's a better chance that it won't screw up when I go back to MonoDevelop. And since this has been so flaky for me, the first thing I do is I go into my controller's designer CS file and I see whether or not the code was written for me. So you can see here, when you make those dragging over things that we just did in Xcode, it makes an outlet for us, which is a public property to that label. And it also makes our partial method to the date, our button selected date click. So you can see there that it has made that. And if you don't see this code in yours, then you need to go back in Xcode and move one of those controls around. Just move it up or down a hair and then save and then go close out of Xcode. And when you come back in, this code will show up. And that happens from time to time. Don't know what to tell you why it happens. I just know how to fix it. So with that, we're just about done here. We just need to write some code to actually add in our ability to see this. So to start out with, I'm in our controller file now, our DatePicker demo controller. And I need to make a private variable that goes to our action sheet. So we have that new control that we made, so let's actually make a variable to it. So AS DatePicker, and we'll just call this AS DatePicker. We have our new control. The next thing we need to do is that when we actually call this guy up by default, we need to go through and actually make this guy, right? If we think about it, that's how we're going to get the basically date from this. So how we're going to do that, how we're going to handle that is inside of here, we just need to write some code that will call up our action sheet guy. So and then we need to handle that touch up inside also event that we basically made earlier that went through and when they click the button, let's bring up this control. So in order to do that, we had a partial method that was made for us. So we have that partial. And when I just type in the word partial, it's as you can see, the little green icon comes up, partial. I'm just going to double tab it and it's going to give me, if I do this right, it will give me a list of the methods that are available, and it's not. And so this is where if you're lazy, you have to go and find the name of the method here. So you can see this is the method that we want, and by theory, it should have auto-completed that for me, and it's not. So it's just told to autocomplete for us by pasting in the method name. So this is the partial method that we're going to write. So when somebody clicks our button, we're going to bring this action sheet up. So we have AS action sheet. What do we call our private variable? Date picker. Equals. And we just need to make a new AS date picker. Now we need to send us the view that we currently have. So in this controller, we have a view. So I'm going to send this controller's local view. Remember, we needed that because we need to know the coordinates of stuff. Now we also can set the title. Remember that we set that as public properties. So we have these public properties that we can use to access. So let's go ahead and access some of our public properties. So we can see title there. We can set that to select a date. Slick, huh? So now that we have that, we need to check what the date is, now we could set the date to a default date before we start showing this thing, right? And depending on how your application's business logic works, you don't necessarily want somebody to have to scroll 100 years to find a year. Say, for example, their birth date. If you make it to today, they may have to scroll for a while. If you know a date range that you're no later than, you could set it to that. I mean, you'll have to figure out your business logic for this. What I'm going to show is I'm going to show you how to set the default date to something. So just because it's a nice way to see this. Now, if you don't do anything, it sets to today's date. But I'm going to show you how to set the date. And how you do that is you can just say AS date picker. And remember that we gave access to our date picker object. And because of that, we can set the date using the set date method. You can see it takes an NS date type. Well, it turns out that they have a direct correlation between the .NET date time and NS date time. So I can just say new date time and give it a date time. So I'm going to give it 1973-49 as the default date. And for animated, I'm just going to say false. I don't need this to animate when it makes the default date time. So now I've set that to default. Like I said, if you did not set that to default, it's not a big deal. It would just default today's date. But now you know how to do that. So the final thing we need to do in our code is handle when the button gets clicked. Handle when the done button on our custom control is clicked. And that's the last thing we need to handle here. So we're going to say our AS date picker dot and our button done, and we're going to handle that touch up inside. We're going to override the default one that we did. If we did nothing, it would just dismiss it. So we need the touch up inside, which U is at the end of the alphabet, so I have to type that, plus equals delegate, and we're going to make a delegate. We could make a method call, but for this, we don't know what we want to do. We want to just set the label. And obviously, you may want to make a method, and you may want to call that based on this and handle all that inside of it. Instead, depending on how big your business logic is, I'm going to leave that up to you. But for my example, I'm just going to make a delegate method. I am feeling kind of lazy on this. So just because the video is already running a little late, and it looks like we have some extra code that came along here. I'm not sure why that came along. Let's just do that to clean it up. I may have accidentally double parentheses myself. So inside of these brackets are our delegate code that we want to do. I like to tab over so that I know that there's basically this is inside of that call. So we need a datetime object. I'm just going to call it DT for datetime equals, and we need to get the datetime from the action picker, date picker control. So we'll say AS date picker, and from here there's a date object, and the date object is, you can see it there. So and now what we could do is we can just say our label date selected dot text equals. I like to use the short, the date time short option. So I'm going to do just DT to short string. Now there's a couple other things we could do. Let's just compile this real quick, and then let me show you a couple of options that you can do with that datetime picker that you may want to be aware of. Let's just start debugging and see what happens. So we're going to go in. It's going to go through. So we have an error already. So let's see if we can debug our error. So what's our error? It's saying, let's go to our error. And it's saying here that we forgot the new keyword here for our new object. Duh. So you guys are probably watching me type that going, wait a minute, Aaron, you forgot the new word. I can't believe that you did that. Well, yep, I did forget it. Sometimes that's what happens when you're not typing from a script and just going from memory. So let's go ahead and select a date. And we can see here nothing happened then. Well, why did nothing happen? Because I forgot to use the show method to show the keyboard, right? We have the select date, but nothing's happening. We have a show method, and the show method was never called inside of our controller. So if we see here, we have this, we're setting the date time, but we're not really handling the do show. So in here, after we set our default date, we should probably do the show method. Makes sense, right? Show the actual control. So let's do that. AS date picker show. That makes sense. Without showing it, we have no ability to do something with it. Now also, you'll notice that we're not hiding it either. So we need to hide it when we're done here. We probably should hide that, but let's see what happens if we don't. Let's go in, pick our datetime picker. Wait for the debugger. We can see we're simulating IS6, like I was telling you. And let's see if our debugger comes up. Here it is. Datetime select. We can see, yay, there's our control, and it's set to our default date, which is kind of cool. So I can kind of go through and select that, select maybe the 1980, hit the word done, boom. 5/9/1980 set to our label, exactly how we selected it. If we change it Maybe we'll set it to September 9th of 1984, for example, or 83. Why not? 9/9/1983. Pretty slick. We have a really cool control. And if we take a look at that, it looks pretty similar to Apple's. We have a selected date for our label that we selected. We have our nice little rectangle that we built up here. You can see that we have a little frame around our button, and we have these nice control that Apple provides for free for selecting our dates. Pretty slick way of handling this. Now, with that, I wanted to show you a couple more things before I leave, and that is that you can set the min and maximum date, so people can't set a certain date range. So, for example, if you know that your application is a business application and it's within a certain date and time you want to run reports, maybe, for example, what you could do is you can go into here in your code after we set the date, or before, it doesn't really matter, ASDatePicker.datePicker. That's our control that we have, and then min and maximum date. So you can see here we have a minimum and maximum date that we can use. Let's start with minimum date equals, and then we can just say a new date time. So if you take a look here, it's a public property, minimum date, and it takes in just an NS date, which I just was explaining. We can convert to a date time variable. So we can say new date time. And we just pass in, like, let's just say that 1950, 1/1 is the minimum date that they can put in. And the maximum date would be today, right? They can't go into the future. So date time picker, that's a good one to have. Maximum date equals, and everyone should know this in .NET, is the date time object now. So that they can't go any further than today, you know, in this date selection. So they can't go in the future, they can go in the past, up to 1950. Let's go ahead and compile this again and do another show of this, and then we'll pretty much summarize the video here. So we take a look here, we have some cool options that we're doing with the date time picker. We're launching our good old debugger with our simulator. And let's take a look at that. So we have here, we're doing our simulator. Let's go backwards, see how fast we can go backwards. We keep dragging it down, and we can see that it's gray, the dates. So see they're gray? Can't select them. If we hit done, and we try, well, look, see, we try to go 1949, it instantly put us to 1950. It has now locked us out of the ability to do anything prior to 1950. Kind of cool. Let's go in the future and see if we can maybe set it to 1918. As you can see, automatically defaulted to today's date, which is September 30th of 2012. So we've now got some min and max dates that we've automatically set in here. Let's just go ahead and set May 30th. And there we go. We have May 30th of 1994. I'm going to close our simulator, and we're pretty much done. So within this, what we got is a custom control. The custom control is of the ASDatePicker type. Inside of our customer control, we're using basically a bunch of built-in Apple controls. And we've got 4 of them that we're using. We're using the action sheet. We're using a done button that they click when they're done typing it in. We're using a title, and then somebody passes us whatever view they're in. The reason that they're passing us the view because we're not really sure how big the screen is, and we're going to use that view to steal the properties from it so that we don't have to calculate that ourselves. And by doing that, we have a very agile customer control that you can use in any one of your projects very quickly. As you can see, within the controller itself, you don't have to know all that much about it. We make a new one, we send it our current view, we set the title, and we set some min and maximum dates if we wanted to. We could comment all this out and basically be left with basically the ability to make the new control, setting the title for it, and doing the show method. Now, obviously, we want to do a delegate to handle the button done so that we can get the date time from the control when it's done. But we didn't even have to do that if we didn't want to, but we would have never then had the ability to actually get the data from it. With that, I'm done. So we have a demo project out there. I will try to get this out on the internet, and I will save this code out there, and I will set where the code is in the comments of the actual YouTube video. I want to thank everybody for watching. The next videos I'm going to actually be doing are actually due with MonoMac. I'm working on a corporate project, converting a C# application over to the actual Mac itself, not MonoTouch. So I'm going to have a couple videos that explain how to do some things that I've learned in that process. I have to admit that I've done some iPhone applications before with MonoTouch, but I've never once done a Mac application. So it's been a learning process for me. I learned a lot of different things that are different between WinForms and the Mac. I have done Mac applications though in Object-C. So I've done hard-coded regular Mac Cocoa applications, we call them. So it's getting a little bit familiar with the nuanced differences between the development kit here and the C#. And if you're asking why would you do that, the simple reason is that, one, you may have a bunch of C# code laying around to talk to things like web services or a SQL database. In the Mac world, we don't have the ability to do that in Object-C. There is no ODBC driver per se to talk to SQL Server built in native to the phone. So if you want to talk to SQL Server on your app and you have some C# code to do that, or if you want to write some C# code, this mono-develop with the MonoTouch or with the Mono Mac is the perfect way to do that. Cheers, everybody. Hope you have a great day.